There's no shortage of good material out there on how to be a great leader. But though there are mountains of material on good leadership, there is a lack of actual good leaders. Part of that is what we talked about last week, that humility is the base ground level requirement of a good leader. Without humility, you will never be a great leader. And that's brought out simply by what Jesus says. If you're going to be the greatest of all, you're going to serve all. If you're going to be the leader, you have to serve others. And there's sacrifice in that. And leadership is sacrifice. And today I want to talk about the next thing. Last week we talked about Nehemiah, his humble beginnings and the humility he had, and how God used that to put him in a place, even though he had no previous record of leadership in his life. God knew his heart, and he knew he was a man who just did what he could with what he was given. This is the For Real Life and Godliness podcast. I am your host, as always, Pastor Will. We're going to talk about Nehemiah for a few more times. So today we're going to talk about the idea of the buy-in. How a leader gets those he is leading to buy into his vision and into the purpose that God has given him to lead them through. And we're going to talk about that right after this. If this is your first time on the podcast, welcome. My name is Will Mercer. I am a pastor in Western North Carolina, and this is my podcast, the For Real Life and Godliness podcast from Peter, where he says God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. And I say that life is Zoe, is real life. It is the biological life that you are living. And so Peter essentially is saying that you have everything you need to live the biological life you have here and the spiritual life, godliness, righteousness, how to live life properly towards God and towards others. And so we have all of it. And the purpose in this whole podcast was to kind of disambiguate, if that's a right word, I think that's right, the Word of God. And as I always say, to take the Word of God and put it into the grit of your real life where you can actually use it. Because if we can't translate the Word of God from the pew or the pulpit or the seat or the cushion chair or whatever it is that you may sit in every Sunday or Wednesday, if you can't translate it from in there into the real world, then there's a problem, because the Word of God is a real world solution for every single thing that we deal with on a daily basis, and I believe that. And leadership, number one, because leadership, as I said probably 2 episodes ago, I believe, that all of us are leading somebody somewhere. We may not all have titles, we may not all have positions, but we are all leading people somewhere, whether we're leading our family, our friends, our coworkers, or people under us if we are in positions of authority. So no matter what, we all have some level of influence. Unless you're like a hermit in a cave somewhere, you have influence. And as John Maxwell said, leadership is influence. And I don't know if it started with him or with somebody else, but that reality is that leadership is simply influence, and you influence people all the time. So if you're not a leader right now, or you're aspiring to be a leader, or you are one, all of these things will apply in some way, somehow. But specifically, we're talking to those who are in leadership, who are looking to that goal. And as I said in our first episode of this second season, I've had plenty of experience in leadership roles in varying different places, in secular work, in religious work, all over the place, everywhere. And many of those things I was thrown into and just had to make do with what it was and figure it out as I went, which is great, because that's how I am. I'd rather learn on the job with hands-on. I do not learn very well from reading material or even watching. I do better with watching, but I have to see it. And normally, if I want to learn something, I have to actually do it. And so that's usually how I learn the best. And but in those years, especially as a project manager, where I had to learn to keep the flow of things from one end of a project to the other, to keep budgets going, to keep the work goals of each week and then each block, each month, and everything going, so that by the time we reach the end, we're on time, under budget, and everybody's happy. Part of that is having your people buy into what you're doing. And when you're in contracting in that world, people are going to need to buy in one sense, because they're getting paid to do it, and they have to survive. In the church world, in many cases, that is not the motivating factor because many people are just volunteering and they're there to do what's right. And it becomes even more important when you're dealing with volunteers that you have them buy in. And when I say buy in, I mean that they, on their end of things, are buying into what you're doing. Like you are leading them, but they are following very voluntarily. That's probably not the best way to say that, but they're following you on a voluntary basis, and they can just up and leave if they want, right? Now, if someone is committed and bought in, even if you have some issues and friction between you and that person, if they have the proper level of buy-in, proper level of ownership on their end of things, then you can deal with discrepancies or disagreements, generally speaking. But if somebody is not bought in at all, and they're just there because they think it's a good idea or they thought it sounded good, and then when they get to know you and you guys just don't mesh and don't gel like you think, it's going to be very difficult for that person to stick around or for you to even want them to stick around because there's going to be constant friction. And friction is not always bad. I like to say that friction means you're moving. All things in the world require friction to move. If your tires did not have friction, your car would not move down the road. It is an integral part of our world. Friction is there for a reason, and we will not always agree with the people that we are leading. Or if you are following somebody and you're listening to this, you won't always agree with the people who are leading you, which is great. Because if we all were the same, we had the same brain, same thoughts, then we would never get very far, because it's necessary to have multiple angles at every subject, which is why humility, as we talked last week, is so important. You have to have humility as a leader because you have to first admit that you don't know everything. Yes, you are responsible, generally speaking, for everything because that's just how leaders, that's what happens to leaders. You are responsible for everything, but you do not know everything. And to act like you do because you feel like that's the picture that you need to portray of yourself, the facade to put up, if that's what you think, then you're not going to get the best out of those you lead. Because if you don't admit that you might need their advice, you may very well be sitting on a gold mine of an idea that's locked up in one of your people's heads, and you will never access that vault of very valuable information, that one thing that could take your organization or your company or even your personal relationship to the next level, because you would never even conceive that there was something outside of your field of vision as far as your knowledge and understanding of what you're doing goes. And the people that you lead and the people that lead you, there is this level of humility on both ends of things. And as Peter says in his letters, we need to be submissive one to another. He talks about, in the church world, he talks about the elders and the overseers and how they ought to lead. Then he talks about the younger, that they ought to submit to the elders and wait for God to lift them up and to learn while they can, while they're under those who lead them. But he ends that whole thing, kind of caps it off with the idea that we need to be submitted to one another in humility, and that God resists the proud and he lifts up those and gives grace to those who are humble. So humility is an integral part of the church, and it's also, as I just explained, an integral part of leadership as well. But there is obviously the reality that a leader is leading, and so those who are following him are following, and there is that paradigm, and it's undeniable, and it's required. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't need, a leader or a follower or whatever. It has to happen, and there has to be people, and people need to be led from one place to another, and that's what a leader does. He's not a boss. He is a person who is taking those who are with him from one place to another, and generally he's taking them from one place to, or he's taking them to a place that he himself has already been. In this case, we are going into actually something what you might call a frontier, and Nehemiah is kind of a pioneer because he's coming into a place and trying to do something that no one's done yet. It was supposed to have already been done, but it's not, and he has to get them to buy into this vision And the difficulty in his case is that he's trying to get people to buy in who have already been where he has just come to. And so it's almost the reverse of what I just said. He's trying to lead them in something that they in themselves may have a little bit more idea about, because he just showed up. He's been living in the palace this whole time. And the people have been here living, as it said, in disrepair, basically, and in much trouble. And he's trying to lead them out of that trouble, not away from Jerusalem, but to a better place, a better life, I guess you could say, right where they're at. And he needs them to get into and buy into this vision of a wall rebuilt. And, there'll be a temple rebuilt later and all this other stuff, but the wall, the protection of the city, a city broken down without walls, is a city that has no defense and no real purpose. That's what cities kind of are, at least in that period of time. A city was defined by its walls. Like Jericho was literally defined by the thickness of its wall. It was known as a fortress that you could not get inside of. And here, Jerusalem lays in ruins, obviously due to the sins of the people, but God is trying to bring people back home. And Cyrus already made the decree, and now here we have Artaxerxes, which I think, I may not be right on this, is 3 kings later, maybe? I may be wrong on that, but 3 or 4 kings later, I believe. And these things have not happened yet. And so here's Nehemiah finally trying to put, the rubber to the road and actually get things going. And he needs the people to see the vision and see the mission like he sees it. You remember in chapter 1 where his brothers show up, he immediately begins to mourn, it says. If you look in chapter 1, it says in verse, it is 4, "When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned many days. And I was fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." And he has this empathy for them, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but he feels for people that he is not in the situation of. We talked about how he had to step down from a cushy, comfortable position and to go into the waste wilderness of what is now Judea and Jerusalem to help these people that are his brothers, but maybe don't have to, he doesn't have to do it. Like he could have just lived his life like everybody else was doing in Babylon, or not Babylon, I guess it was Babylon or that area, but it had been conquered at this point. And he could have just stayed there and chilled at Shushan the palace, as it says. But he chooses not to, because his heart is moved for his people. He has to have empathy. Not only do you have to have humility, but you have to have empathy. You have to feel for your people. But on the opposite side of that, you also have to have purpose. Empathy gets you to feel for your people and lead them along at the rate that they're capable of doing, and to feel for their pain and their inadequacies. But purpose asks people to reach beyond their limitations and beyond their inadequacies to do more than they've ever done before. And these people here have had their limitations probably for most of their lives. I'm not sure how long these people had lived in this state, but I know from the destruction of Jerusalem until Cyrus was 70 years. And then when them coming back to build it was even longer, where Nehemiah is now. So this is generations of failure that these people have experienced, and they don't know how to succeed. They don't know how to build the walls back. They have either become complacent, or it's just like, well, yeah, it was a good idea, but it just never happened. And Nehemiah's here to finally get that vision going, and he needs them to buy into it. And in order to do that, he has to feel for them, as he does here in chapter 1, but he also needs to give them purpose. He needs to bring them to the reality, like, look, we cannot just sit here. I know you've had it rough. I know your life's been bad. I know that you have not been led right in the past, but that's over and that's gone. And now it's time to get to work. But a good leader has to have the balance between empathy and purpose, because too much empathy leads to no progress and really complacency, and everything kind of levels out, and there's this equilibrium that happens where everybody's just kind of getting by. The status quo sets in when there's too much empathy in the leader and not enough purpose. But if there's too much purpose, then you run the risk and really the reality that you'll overwork, overtax, and just overwhelm your people, and they won't be able to do it, or they'll leave, as we said, if it's in a volunteer situation, which it kind of is here. They don't have to do what he says. He is kind of made a governor, but he's not necessarily the governor yet in full view of everybody. He's just shown up, and any leader knows when you show up with a new group of people, and if I were to go to a job site and I had a whole new group of subs or people who came to do a certain job, you have to get to where they are. You have to get into their mindset, and you have to bring them to where your mindset is. And there's this bridge that needs to be crossed every time as a leader you come to a new group of people. There has to be this bridge crossed, and you have to almost meet in the middle, shake hands, discuss the direction that you need to go, and then turn around and say, all right, it's time to go, let's go. And you get people to buy in, number one, as I said, by showing empathy. And you see in chapter 2, verse 17, where he's going to bring these two ideas together. And his empathy is shown not just because he cried in the palace when he's there, but here in chapter 2 and verse 17, he also, in a sense, very real sense, kneels down with them in the dirt where they are. He gets on their level. He condescends, and he has to because he's not one of them. He doesn't have their experiences. He doesn't know where they're coming from necessarily. He, though, had learned about their state from his brothers, as I said, he's never experienced it. And so he has to get down on their level. And you see it in chapter 2, verse 17. He said, then I said unto them, you see the distress that we are in. And he goes on and talks about Jerusalem in waste and its gates burned with fire. But he immediately has this idea that I'm here with you in this moment. He says, you know that the problem that we are in. He didn't say, hey, you guys, look around you, look at the waste you guys have allowed to happen. Like, it's your fault. You know, he's not pointing fingers. He's not blaming them, even though they probably had some blame because none of them ever did anything. And it probably wasn't their fault, probably their father's fault or whoever led them back into the land or whatever. But he doesn't sit there and waste time trying to figure out why the walls are not built back. He simply gets down on their level and says, you see the distress that we are in. And one of the ways that you can get, the most effective ways that you can get people who are prospective followers, people you need to come along to you, is that you have to buy into them first before they will buy into you. And they need to buy into you before they buy into your vision. And that's always how it's going to work. You showing up and saying, this has to be done, you bunch of idiots. You need to get up off your butts and get to work. That never works. Even if, in my case, when I was a project manager, you know, the difference between that and me leading ministries obviously was different. But in that world, there are people, and I could have shown up and said that, and I could have made them do what I wanted them to do, because if you don't, I'll send you home, or I'll get you fired, or you won't get paid, or yada, yada, whatever. And I could have used that. I could have used that kind of mindset. But I found that it was much better, and you have much better quality work, a better work atmosphere, more work got done when the people know that you guys are working together on this project and not against each other. Sometimes there was the reality of me just showing up and doing work that generally I shouldn't do as a project manager, but there are times when it's necessary to take part of the work. That's not a constant thing. It's something that you have to learn where and when to do that, because not only is there there needs to be a certain separation, but I was not as good at doing the work that I know needed to get done. And when I did the work, I was better at it. But after a couple years with me leading, I was not at all good at much of the labor and the things that needed to be done on a daily basis as the people that I was leading were. They were better at it than me. And my job, and this is one of the hardest things I had to overcome when my boss first had me become a supervisor before a project manager, one of the things he had to talk to me about and set me down about was doing the work for people, because I didn't give people enough room to fail and so on and so forth. And so there has to be that. And then I don't want to get into that whole thing right now. But reality is you do have to show buy-in. You have to buy into your people before they're going to buy into you, and they will have to buy into you before they will buy into your vision. That is, as I said, the format, the progress, the plan, the roadmap. It's you showing up, buying into them, taking part in their struggle, getting on their level, saying, you guys see, man, where we're at. This place is a wreck, and we are in distress. We are, and this may be kind of the royal we, and if you've ever worked under somebody, you know all about the royal we, when people in staff meeting or in on your project meeting outside of a job, and the boss shows up, and he's like, hey, we're going to do such and such a thing, and whatever, and you know in your head, he means you. But it makes you feel like we're all in his thing together. And once in a while, my boss, even himself, would show up and do some of the work or things that he was, he specialized in, that he could show and teach us. And he would show up and just to kind of show like, hey, I've been here before, I've done this before. And sometimes you need to do that. But the reality is you just need to find a way to connect with them, to buy into them, to show them that you are there with them. And if you do that, the end of verse 17, which is very quick, it shows you what happens. It says, I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. And then he invites them to come to his purpose. He buys into them, and then he invites them to come to his purpose as though it were both of their purposes already, which it should have been. But obviously it was not, because the walls weren't built, so it wasn't their vision at this moment. But he invites them, says, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, and we may no longer be a reproach. Right? And so he buys into them first. He's talking about we. He has this idea that we are in this together. We are a team, and this is the thing that's happening. We're in this bad situation. But man, it doesn't have to be that way. Come together with me. We will rebuild these walls, and we will no longer have this problem. He says, I'm with you. This is the problem. If you come with me and work alongside what my plan is, this problem will no longer be the problem. And he says, we have this problem together. I'm not separate from you. I'm not going back home, which he generally doesn't do, except for, I think, once or twice. He stays here when he doesn't really have to. He could have just said, hey, this is what you need to do. Go ahead and do it. But that's what everybody else had done before, I would assume, which is why it never got done. And so he stays and he says, we are in this thing together. This is the problem. Come with me and we'll fix it. And I told them, and then he tells them about the blessing he's had so far. And he says, look, I told them the hand of my God had been with me, or had been good upon me, and also the king's words that he had spoken to me. And then the end, it says, so they said, right? So we have Nehemiah buying into them, saying, we are in this thing together. This is my purpose. Come with me into that purpose, and your problem that we all now have together will no longer be a problem. And this is how they follow up. Let us. They have now bought into him. He is part of them. Let us rise up and build. And they set their hands to this good work. And so he doesn't show up as a conqueror or as a governor or as someone who is in charge, as most people want to do. He shows up as one of them, on their level, with humility, as we talked about last week, empathy towards their problem and their issues, but with purpose. And he invites them, not commands them, but he invites them to partake in this good work, and they are on board immediately. Here's this guy. He has no reason to be here. He is not somebody we would have ever thought would show up. And yet here he is. He's standing in the rubble. And if you read earlier verses, he had already gone and walked throughout the entirety of Jerusalem to see the damage and to kind of assess what his purpose really meant. And they know that he's there, and they know that he's with them in this dirt, in the grit of their real life. And he's standing with them. And he says, come with me. I will help you, and we will do this thing together. And they immediately respond. He has humility. He shows empathy. He vision casts, I guess, this purpose and invites them to come with him in it. And they immediately respond with enthusiasm, and they look at each other, let us rise up and do this thing together. And sorry, I started preaching there for a second. It's hard for me to differentiate that sometimes. But let us rise up and build. And then he said they set, and this is his commentary on them. Remember, this is almost like much of this is written from his perspective, his personal point of view, his POV. And he said, they set their hands to this good work. This is his assessment of how they responded to his condescension, his invitation to them, and they rise up. And he says, they set their hands. They went to work. They did it without any kind of grumbling or complaining. And now that's a great beginning. And that's usually where most, especially pastors, walk into a new church or a guy walking into a new organization. They'll start off here and they'll do really good. And everybody's like, yeah, enthusiasm, or let's go, let's take on the world. And eventually the size of the work, the amount of work to be done, wears on everyone. And so the initial enthusiasm is going to require what I meant to talk about today, which we won't, we'll talk about next week. The amount of problem that is here in Jerusalem and the amount of problem that you'll probably face in whatever you're dealing with, the initial enthusiasm will not carry you through to the end of the project. And the amount of work that Nehemiah has to do is grueling, and it weighs and it grinds down on all the people, even though he's showing them as much empathy as he can. And then you read later on in the book, he even sets people near their houses. And so he makes it as simple, as clear. He doesn't make it ambiguous or difficult or arduous just for the sake of it. He sets each person by their house to work, which did one of a couple of different things. It did one, that they didn't have to walk as far to get to where they needed to work, which was less work for them to do. But two, it's because of ownership. Not only do you need people to buy into your vision, but they need to know that they're part of it. And he set them literally as part of it, because they would build the wall that was nearest their homes. And so when you have them buy in, the idea of buying is that you now become owner, or at least part owner, of whatever you've bought. And so you've bought into them, right? And so you have some ownership in their struggle. And now they have some ownership in your vision. And together you can work that out and begin to move forward. But even with all of that, we'll see later, tomorrow, next week, or whatever, that grit is necessary, because it says the amount of garbage, the amount of trash, the amount of debris was excessive. And it was difficult for them to do the work. Not only that, but you'll also see not only were there problems within the city because of the trash, we'll see that there are problems within the city because of some of the other rulers who are the opposite of everything we've talked about today, who are not humble, who like to sit back in comfortable chairs and like to take advantage of the people who were there because of their position. And not only that, but we also have external forces and enemies and problems that are pressing in and crushing Nehemiah and all the work that he's trying to do here. And so we'll see, as we progress through this, how much grit really comes into the picture. But it starts here. It starts with humility Then it continues with empathy towards them, but you have to have that purpose that you're calling them from where their problem is into a solution. While you buy into them, they'll buy into you, and then they'll buy into your vision just like here, and they'll go to work with enthusiasm. And then when the inevitable happens, where the enthusiasm of the initial, say in a church, it's like a year or 2 years, the honeymoon phase, they call it, is over. And you get into the grueling every day of ministry and the fact that things have not progressed in a year or 2 years like you thought, or maybe even the people thought. And there becomes grumblings and complainings, or there's people in the church who are treating others with disrespect, or they have some position of leadership they've had for 15 or 20 years, and they've been misusing that, like the people in the story. Or there are people outside trying to destroy the church or your organization or your business or whatever it might be. They're always going to be, after this initial push of enthusiasm, this wall of friction that you've got to push through. And it's going to take grit and this determination and commitment to the goal and to whatever your vision is and whatever God has placed in your way to do. As we talked about last season, we can do all things through Christ because God, if we're following Him, has put them in our life for us to accomplish them. But that does not mean it's going to be easy, and it's probably going to be the most difficult thing that you've ever done in your entire life. That will be the next episode of the For Real Life and Godliness podcast. As always, I am your host, like I said, Pastor Will, and I hope you enjoyed today. If you are new, go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you are on YouTube, and like it and share it with someone else, because if it helped you, it'll probably help someone else. If you're on Spotify or Apple, go ahead and rate us highly. If you didn't like what you heard today, just go ahead and tell me without rating me low, and I will fix that if I need to fix it and all that good stuff. But we love you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.